Let's look at an overview of the installation of SQL Server 2016. There have been some changes in the installation of SQL Server. Most are related to separating parts of the overall software package, and others are new features. The Installation Center separates the services from Management Studio, which is referred to as SSMS, and SQL Server Data Tools, or SSDT. There's still a warning to install .NET 3.5 or the installation fails, and it is not still part of the prerequisite installation of support files. So you'll need to do that previously from running the installation program. The database engine has a file initialization checkbox and a new tab for creating multiple TempDB files. This includes setting the growth and maximum size of the new TempDB files. The business intelligence options have not really changed, but Management Studio, or SSMS, and Data Tools, SSDT, installations need the .NET 4.6 framework installed to run. These are separate installations from the bits to run the services. Most DBAs do not want the client tools like SSMS and SSDT on the actual SQL Server server. This is a requested answered by the SQL Server team. As far as advanced analytics, the R language has prompts for integrating with SQL Server and or installing R as its own service. You also must accept the licensing to have R services installed. Polybase is new for advanced analytics. It's the supporting of the integration of big data, including Hadoop systems, and it integrates it with SQL Server queries. But also part of business intelligence installation is separating the installation of a tabular versus a multi-dimensional installation. These still require their own instance to be installed, so that part of the installation still needs to be looked at. Do I install tabular or do I install the multi-dimensional cube? Also, reporting services has the native installation as well as the SharePoint integration. Be sure to download the proper version to install. This is really the first step in installing SQL Server. You need to know the difference between installing the standard, enterprise, web, developer, or even the express editions. These are all ISO files that have to be either mounted or you install from partial exe files. The rest of the installation will download the data from the internet. If you're installing on a server, there's also some preparation that needs attending. If it's a failover installation, clusterings on the Windows Server level needs to be configured first, and there's a lot of setup to do that. If you're installing on a single machine or VM server virtual machine, you need to install the .NET 3.5 framework first. Most current versions of Windows servers has this in its initial configuration of those operating systems. Servers or VMs usually have SANs attached to them, and you will have to work with your system administrator, if you're not the system administrator, to separate the data from the indexes, from TempDB, from logs, and even from your backup LUNs. Even though most modern SANs today slice LUNs across all disks in a SAN, you still want to separate mounts or LUNs from the data index, TempDB logs, and backups. This enables you to do better I/O monitoring on those individual areas of SQL Server. If you're upgrading from a previous version, backups are essential. you need to make backups of all databases, user, and system. If it's a VM, make sure you have a snapshot of the VM before the installation. This will help to easily revert back in case of problems during the upgrade. The installation program from Microsoft has gotten better and better over the years, so you have less and less problems than previous installations. With such a great SQL Server community, you're sure to find similar problems and resolutions in different forum groups. So, some prerequisites of running the installation of a program. First, you're going to want to log in as someone that has administrative privileges to that server. If you're remoting into the machine, you probably want to use the service account that runs the database services in order to do the installation. That account usually has admin privileges to the physical machine or the VM machine. You're going to want to log in as this administrator. You also have the ability to shift right click on the Setup EXE program as seen in this picture and click the Run as Administrator. This helps with any determination of if you have administrative rights to certain areas of the installation program. This installation program is going to run checks for setup files. This is a prerequisite. The support programs need to be on that machine before you run through the installation. Some will get installed automatically, but others will require you to stop the installation and load the missing setup programs before continuing. This is usually in the case of new features that have been added to SQL Server. Here is a visual of the installation program. We've marked what are services and components from Management Studio from Data Tools. This Installation Center window will show you these three main areas. The first, the services and components, lets you install a new SQL Server standalone instance or add features to an existing installation. This is where you start to get the instance and any other services installed and initially configured. Some client support files are available in this path, but the main objective is to get the SQL Server service and services installed, configured, and running. The second, Management Studio, is actually a separate installation now. No longer is it tied to the services and components. You can run this on a client machine to support a SQL Server installation. The third is the SQL Server Data Tools, or SSDT. This is the installation of the Visual Studio Shell to code for integration services, SSIS, reporting services, SSRS, and analysis services, SSAS. A lot of acronyms there. There is also a set of tools for creating a database project inside of this Visual Studio Shell, as well as a schema and data compare utilities. These are wonderful tools for anyone who has to administer databases in SQL Server. The next area of this Installation Center screen are two for cluster failover installations. This includes adding a new node to a cluster, as well as starting a new cluster installation for the SQL Server components. You still need the Windows clustering first before you can use these features. This is more an advanced topic for installations. There are many more requirements for a cluster installation, including the Windows cluster to be installed, configuration, a quorum disk, and even additional IP addresses for the physical name of a machine and the cluster name of a machine. Again, this is a very advanced topic for SQL Server installations. The last option, and this might be what most people are doing, is upgrading from a previous version. Usually this is a great path to take if everything works out, but we know how that goes. Most of the times you're on an older version of the Windows Server. more RAM needs to be installed, or you have SANs that are not compatible with the current hardware. Then a new installation on a new machine is usually the path most have to take. This is to overcome these limitations, and there's a lot of work that has to be done. So during the initial installation, you're going to get a window that talks about installing setup files. If you notice in this picture, capture of the installation program, the scan for product updates has been completed, and it has skipped the download and extraction of setup files. So it's already passed these steps, and it's in progress of actually installing setup files. This is real new or real helpful during the installation to have these most prerequisites done for you automatically. Sometimes it seems to be taking a while for this to happen. First of all, you would need an internet connection and a fast download in order for it to progress at a reasonable rate. The product updates are for newer versions of support files that the current date of installation does not have. Now you get an automatic way of doing this in SQL Server. Setup files are what is needed to actually configure the SQL Server 2016 installation. First thing it does is extract the files, and then it installs them. This installs all those features that are possibly going to be used during the main part of the installation. This is a self-service option that has been requested for quite a while in the SQL Server community. Microsoft has answered this request nicely. After seeing previous versions of installations, you probably think this is a nice progress being made with SQL Server for the installation of the program. Another step you'll see is the rules validation. Validation of some rules needs to happen before a successful installation. You'll get this validation that either gives you a passed and or warning. If you have a passed and warning, you can proceed. By proceeding, even with a warning, you can click on the warning to see the message provided. There might be some additional configuration like firewall ports to add after installing. This will not fail an installation, but it might make the access limited to others to connect to this installation. So in this case, the passed and warnings let you proceed. But if there's a failure, the wizard will stop and you cannot continue. You have to fix the problem and the error before you can continue. What usually happens is you have to do a restart. By clicking on the warning message, you will be given details about the failure. The next screen you'll see is the features that you have to select in order to proceed with the installation. If you notice in the features part, a checkbox is next to features that we're going to install. You'll also see some shaded out checkboxes. That means those features have already been installed on this server. The top part, Database Engine Services, is specific to the instance of this installation. You can have multiple instances on a single server. But the shared features towards the bottom, actually it contains more of the bottom area, are features that have to be shared between instances. The Database Engine section, there are two new options. R Services, which is checked, and Polybase Query Services, which is checked. These are new features to SQL Server. They are advanced analytic features for 2016. By checking these, new services not in the older versions will be installed and will need configuration and, more importantly, maintenance. They're also going to take up RAM and CPU resources outside of SQL Server. So if you do baselines to monitor your machines, you may have to update your baselines from previous version installation to understand resource issues now. The bottom of the screen still contains the location for the support files. The data and backup locations are still in the configuration stage of the installation program. Because of installing some of these new features, a new rule check is going to happen after you select your features. An example here is a failed rule check for support files needed for installing Polybase. If you cannot click the next button because it is disabled in the wizard, and you have really two options for continuation. One is to install the third-party feature requested by this failed rule check. The other would be to backtrack in the installation and uncheck the Polybase option. Then you could continue with your instance installation and install this new feature later. You might need more research about what this third-party option needed requires on your machine. You might not, security-wise, be able to install this for the Polybase option. You need to get together with your system administrator and determine if that need is correct. One of the big new features is TempDB's configuration. Before, everything defaulted for the TempDB. Now, TempDB has a configuration tab of its own during the database engine configuration. The tab will have some default suggestions like the number of files, initial size, and auto growth. It also will have a default data directory for the installation of TempDB, as well as some TempDB log file defaults, including the location. But most best practices suggest that you have up to 8 files in TempDB and no more. It's more of an advanced configuration and management to go over 8 files. The way they make that determination in this default program is it uses the same number of files as CPUs. But most best practices, as you read on the internet, say to make the number of files 1/2 the numbers of CPUs on the physical machine or vCPUs on a virtual machine, but still don't go over 8. There are many articles to read, and it's definitely an advanced topic to test to make sure what you put in here is the best option. But DBA is going to be overwhelmingly happy that this is part of the installation now. Microsoft is learning. They're listening to us, they're listening to their MVPs, and they're listening to DBAs. This request for more configuration for TempDB is nothing but a good thing. Because we're installing our services, there's a license agreement. There's a button that you need to click to accept it, and until you do that, the next button of the wizard will not be available. If you do not want to accept this installation, you will have to back out through the wizard, uncheck the R integrations, and it'll bypass this screen. Let's go through the installation of SQL Server 2016. We have an ISO file here downloaded from the Developers Edition with Service Pack 1. If we right-click on this particular file, we can mount it, and it can become a virtual DVD for us. Once we get that volume mounted, we can go to the Setup program. If you hold down the Shift key and right-click, you'll see two options as Run As. If you run as administrator, this will help make sure that you have all the correct permissions if you're already logged in as an administrator to run this program. If you happen to be remoted into a computer and you have an Active Directory service account you want to use to do the installation, then you can click the Run as Different User, provide the domain and login along with this password if that's what has the rights you want to run the service. We've already launched this, so I'm going to bring up the Installation Center, and the first thing you see is a menu choice for planning. Here is our hardware and software requirements, security documentation, and the release notes. There's 2 apps to do a configuration checker as well as an upgrade advisor. Then you have a list of links to help files to help you with planning for an installation or upgrade. We'll click the installation link and we'll get the new install SQL Server standalone or add additional features as the top of our list. The second and third options are for Management Studio and Data Tools, which are now completely separate installations. For advanced installations of clusters, you have New Failover Cluster Installation and Add New. These were all in previous versions of SQL Server, as well as a link to an upgrade from a previous version. The new feature here is New R Server Standalone Installation, which will install an R server on your particular machine. We're going to go to New SQL Server Standalone Installation and click there. It's going to do some checks on our systems and some rule validations. New to 2016 is if they pass all of them, they'll actually skip those particular windows. This one is looking for our setup files, the download, extract, and install. And because we have a previous installation on this machine, it bypasses it. It stops at the install rules because it gives a warning about firewalls. Now this is not a failure. It's just a prompt to tell you that you need to make sure your ports are open if you have a firewall installed. And it sees that the Windows firewall is active on this machine. I'm going to click Next, and we're going to give the option of a new installation versus add features. We're going to do a new installation, which is not any different than previous versions. The free edition here is the Developers Edition. We do not have to provide a product key. But if you're installing the Standard or Enterprise, you need to enter that product key now. Of course, there's a license agreement, and we all know that we should scroll through and read everything about the licensing of this particular installation. We are doing a Developers Edition, so we do not have the license to use this installation as a production version of SQL Server. We'll accept the license terms and click Next. Now it's going to look out there to see what exists, and we're going to be prompted for the instant features versus shared features. So every installation of SQL Server has something related to instances, which is your services, data engine, analysis service, and reporting services, and then you have shared features towards the bottom, which can be shared between instances, which is nice to have as part of your installation. The database engine, of course, is always needed for an installation, but replication is not something new to 2016. New to 2016 is R services in database and Polybase query services. So we're going to check both of those because those are new items. And if you go to the feature description, it'll describe this particular feature to you. So if you're not sure what they are, you can read about them. Remember, if you don't need this feature right now, leave it off and come back and install later. Now for shared features, R Service Standalone is something new, and it's installed totally separate as a service, but most of the other things are shared between installations. You still have your reporting services, links to SharePoint, your client utilities, as well as documentation. We could change the instance root path, but we can't change the feature paths because they've already been used for a previous installation of an instance. So as we click Next, it's going to check these things. The R services in database is the advanced analytics added to SQL Server. Polybase is links to Hadoop install, where you can do searches between SQL Server data and Hadoop or big data. We're going to give this a name instance, and it's going to add that to our instance ID, and we're going to click Next. Here we're going to be prompted for things about the services running on this particular instance. We want to go through these next options just to make sure that we have everything selected that we intend on using on this install. The Polybase is going to be standalone, and we don't have a scale out group. So we'll click Next here, and then we get the prompt for service accounts. These are the accounts that are going to be created on this particular machine to run the services that we want to install. New to 2016, if you have Polybase selected, is the engine and data movement. So those are two new services that are going to be installed. It's a best practice to use an Active Directory account when you're installing on a production system. So when you change the account to an Active Directory account, you are going to have to provide a password for that. The correlation has not changed, so we won't review that, but there is a grant perform volume maintenance task. This was a particular thing you had to configure after the installation through local policies. Now it's been added to the installation programs, and they even give you a link to click to find details. Microsoft has done a marvelous job of blogging and linking a lot of the information. We're going to pick mix mode and give our essay a password. We're also going to click add current user, so my login will be an administrator to this instance. The data directories have not changed, but what has changed is the tempdb tab. This is new, and it goes and finds how many CPUs you have running this particular machine. It saw that it wants to spread the tempdb to 4 data files. The best practice so far from what I've read is that 8 is the max, and you really want to go on 1/2 as many files as CPUs. There's a thing called tempdb contention, and Microsoft is trying to give you the ability to catch it up front rather than after the installation. So we could change the initialization size, the auto growth. For the files, we can remove its default and add a different path for our tempdb. We can also change the size of the log file and the increments for that log file. So now we're able to spread this across different areas, and we don't have to worry about doing this after the installation. Here I'm changing where the log file is going to exist. In the file stream, nothing has changed here in SQL Server 2016. We'll click next, and it's going to ask for an acceptance of the R licensing agreement. Once we click accept, it's going to go through some validation and configuration for us for the install, and then we're just going to have to click the next button. Once we do that, it's going to give us a list as a summary of what's going to be installed for our Learn Now instance of SQL Server 2016. We can scroll through this list and determine if what we have selected is correct. If not, we can go back and change some of these features. After we click install, it's going to list out everything that succeeded and everything that failed. Probably everything's going to succeed if you have the right permissions to do the installation of SQL Server 2016. Before we leave the installation section of this course, let's talk briefly about the Developers Edition with Service Pack 1, which is available free from Microsoft. In previous installations of SQL Server, there was always a fee for the Developers Edition. Starting with 2016, they gave it to you free if you signed up for Visual Studio Dev Essentials. Then you could download the Developers Edition for free. Previous versions, it ranged from $50 upwards to a couple hundred and even maybe close to $1,000. So this is something that's different than other database applications. You're able to use and learn the Developers Edition, which has all the features of Enterprise on a development or QA environment. This is a big deal. There's a link at this website for this free copy of the Developers Edition, which you usually can install on a client machine. You want to look at this installation before you provision a new server. Again, the Developers Edition has all the features of Enterprises, but you are not licensed to use it in a production type environment. Microsoft gives you everything you need to test run the most powerful relational database management system around.